AI agents give it hands, right? With the agents, now the LLM can actually interact with the real world, and MCP puts tools into the agent's hands.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the DevOps is in the details. I'm Ned Bellavant, and with me is my esteemed co-host, Kyler Middleton. Hey, Kyler, what are we talking about today?
Hey, Ned, and hey, everyone listening. Guiding us through the capabilities and pitfalls of MCP is our guest, Dan Barr, a senior technical marketing engineer at Stacklok, a startup focused on building tools to help developers use AI code generation with more control and confidence. Let's talk to Dan.
I know that our audience is going to be riveted by our talk of VMware and shared storage systems. That is why they clicked on the link or downloaded the podcast. Right, Dan?
Absolutely. Seamless transition from shared storage for VMware to MCPs. Yeah.
My first shared storage system was also for a VMware cluster, and it was for HPE. It was like when HPE was just like one big company, and I'm trying to remember the name of the storage system. It was the only one they had at the time.
So this was before they bought Left Hand.
This is before they bought Left Hand and before they bought 3PAR. So they had their own like storage solution that hung around for a really long time. And I found it at some old customers who were still relying on it. And I was like, we got to get you off this thing.
Is it StorageWorks? I'm Googling to find names.
Oh, geez.
This predates me in tech by just a little bit. I don't want to call you old, Ned. I just want to say it predates me a little bit.
I feel like you just did, Kyler. We can figure that out later. I'll put it in the show notes. Dan Barr, welcome to Day 2 DevOps. We're very excited to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Hey, you bet. And the context, the reason we wanted to have you on is because this whole MCP, this model context protocol thing has like blown up in the last month, well, few months, really. And I think Kyler raised an interesting question. And maybe, Kyler, you want to take this part. Like, what was the question you asked on LinkedIn that got Dan involved in the conversation?
I don't remember. What was the question?
Well, you were wondering, like, I'm invoking all these MCP servers. How does it handle security and authentication?
Totally. Yeah. And Dan, I would love to learn that. So MCP, well, I would really prefer you to define it. What is MCP? Why are we all here today?
Yeah, so MCP, it stands for Model Context Protocol. It is an open standard that Anthropic introduced, but not actually all that long ago. It was in November of 2024. So still fairly new, and we know standards like this take a while to develop, and this is no different. But caught fire, right? It really rapidly caught fire. And then the point of MCP is to connect AI systems and large language models to external tools and systems and data sources, right? Anthropic calls it, like, they described it as like USB-C for AI systems, like the universal adapter. The analogy I like to use is like, you have your large language model, which is like a brain in a box. It knows a lot of things, but it's trapped in a box with the knowledge it was trained on, right? It doesn't know anything else, and it can't do anything.
It's Plato's allegory of the cave, right?
Yeah, exactly. And AI agents give it hands, right? With the agents, now the LLM can actually interact with the real world, and MCP puts tools into the agent's hands.
Okay. Yeah. Because I think the other thing that we're familiar with is, the brain in the box. You can feed it more information through something like RAG. So I can hand it, oh, here's some documents, but I'm still just like shoving more information inside the box.
The chatbots that we're all familiar with, right? ChatGPT and Claude, through the web, like they gave it ears and a mouth, right? So like you can give it information through your prompts, through your context, through these other techniques, and they can spit, information and generated text back at you. But then it's taking that to the next level and being able to actually do things with it, which is one of the big differences with agents versus chatbots, is being able to use tools.
Right. Okay. So let's level set. Now we kind of understand what MCP is intended to do. How does it work?
Yeah, the way it works is, so we have these kind of three components, right? We have the large language model that the agent is interacting with and sending prompts and responses back and forth with. And then on the other side, you have the MCP servers. In the MCP servers, you also have like the fourth component is whatever system you're interacting with. It might be an API, it might be with a SaaS service, it might be a database, right, that you're actually into and running SQL through. It might be file system access, it might be command lines tools that it's running. So you have these kind of three or four components depending on how you think about it. The agent basically queries the MCP server for a list of tools. And the MCP server wraps whatever is behind it into this list of tools. And it exposes the tool name, a description of what the tool does, and a little bit of structured inputs that it needs to be able to run the tool. And this all gets sent by the agent up to the LLM when it's interacting as context. And so now the LLM knows, oh, hey, if I need to do something to work through and reason through this task, I can request to the agent to execute this tool and give it the structured inputs that it needs. And then the agent will go along and back to the MCP server, execute whatever tool, and send the results back to the LLM.
It is so exciting to be able to start giving these agents tools to do stuff. It's also very scary that they might do the wrong thing. Is there any kind of, maybe this is jumping the shark, any kind of governance in place to say, like, don't go delete all my servers to speed the rest of the system up? Like the database is under load. I deleted all the front end. You're good now.
Sort of. Ultimately, an MCP, most MCP servers, they're just an executable, right? It is an executable, and the initial assumption was that it was just an executable running locally, one-to-one, right next to the agent that's calling it. So, if your agent is, say, Copilot in Visual Studio Code, the assumption is the MCP is just an executable running on your laptop. And there's kind of that one-to-one. And so technically anything you can access, it can access. So it comes down to what the tool definitions are, what the MCP can do. There is a human in the loop element here. So one of the key aspects of agents is that you should authorize tool use. Now, certain clients let you kind of go into YOLO mode and auto-authorize all tool use. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless you want a really, really headless workflow. But there is that human in the loop element. When the LLM instructs the agent to use a tool, your client should prompt you, hey, I'm going to execute this tool. Here are the inputs. Do you want to proceed? So there's a bit of that element to it. But otherwise, kind of no. Like the MCP can really do whatever you can.
Are folks largely just doing read-only stuff for now? Like, just let the bot read, don't let it write, because that's terrifying? Because my heart is beating faster just hearing you talk about this. This auto-approve tools mode. I've seen that switch in VS Code, and no thank you.
No, it's not just limited to read-only mode. So, the way these MCPs are being built, we define these tools. And, the way you want to build it is to be kind of methodical about what tools you expose for what use cases. You don't just want to take your API and say, hey, one-to-one, every method in the API is now a tool, right? That'll overwhelm the LLM. It's too much context. There's not enough description of what each tool does. So you want to be thoughtful about what tools you expose. But yeah, there are definitely MCPs that will not just read. The GitHub MCP can open pull requests and respond to issues and pull requests with comments and push code, create branches. Yeah, so there's definitely an interaction component. There are database MCPs for all the major database platforms that can actually interact with your database in more than just a read-only mode.
Oh, that is frightening.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about the fact that the tools require inputs, well-defined inputs, to perform their actions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining some of those inputs are going to be things like credentials. Because if you want it to go even perform a read against a database, it needs credentials to do that. That raises some red flags for me because I'm now passing my credentials to this third party. Is there any security around that? Making sure that those credentials are secure in transit and being treated properly by the MCP server?
So, sort of. The credentials that the MCP server needs to interact with the backend service are the job of the MCP server. So, they're not actually one of the inputs that you would be sending to and from, like, say, GPT or your large language model, right? So, those kind of stay in the MCP server. That said, again, most of the MCP servers with this kind of like local mentality of them, their configurations live in a plain text config file for the most part on your machine, or maybe they use an environment variable, right? At best, they maybe use an environment variable. So it does mean you're kind of slinging around these API keys or database credentials or whatever you need, to use that backend service in plain text a lot of times.
Okay. So I'm not passing the model this information. When I initially set up my MCP server, that's kind of when I'm going to be passing those credentials in some way, though that's not standardized.
Yeah, you're going to configure the MCP server in your client, and then that's where you would set the credentials. Yeah.
I guess if I'm running it locally, that doesn't make me as worried, though. It still makes me a little worried, though, because I'm passing my credentials off to this script.
Mm-hmm.
Can I inspect or look at what's inside the MCP server?
As long as it's open source, yes. And, they're really in just the, 6 or 7 months that MCP has existed, there are already thousands of MCP servers flying around out there. Part of the reason was they're relatively easy to create, right? There were a lot of these that were just vibe coded, by the community over a weekend. With varying quality, again, not necessarily being too selective with what tools and how the tools are being presented. But it is really important to really vet the provenance of these and to make sure you're using MCPs from trusted sources. Hopefully they're open source and you can examine the code. You should certainly examine the full tool descriptions. There are some potential security issues around prompt injection and tool poisoning that they're known as, where these tool descriptions can be pretty long. In your client, you might only see like the first line or two of it.
Okay.
Buried deeper in the description could be instructions to have the agent do something malicious that you just don't see. So you definitely want to examine those, examine the source, make sure you're using official MCPs from well-known sources, those sorts of things. Honestly, the same things you should be doing with software you run on your machine anyway, but just kind of a new angle at it.
Has this been systematized yet? You said just use verified sources. I know like the GitHub Actions registry, the Terraform registry, they're like a central company that owns the thing, and they verify like this is a trusted partner, or this one's used 50,000 times. This one's been used 8 times because it's Jim Bob's GitHub MCP server. And is there anything like that exists in the ecosystem yet?
There's not an official registry yet, is what I'll say. There have been a lot of community curated lists. There are some companies like, Cursor, one of the popular AI coding tools. They have a large registry. There's, I think, almost 2,000 MCP servers in their registry. There are a handful of others that have popped up. Docker has jumped into the fray. They have created an MCP catalog of containerized MCP servers on the Docker Hub. And actually, just in the last few weeks, the official MCP community has started work on an official registry. But so far, no, there hasn't been that like NPM or PyPy for MCPs. But I think we'll see that emerge now that the community is starting to work on it.
Yeah, the delivery modes that I've seen so far are either written in JavaScript and you run it with Node, Python and you run it with UV seems to be like the preferred mechanism now, which I'd never heard of before. I guess UVX for actually executing it. I was like, okay, what is this thing that I'm now adding to my integration? And then Docker has been the other one. And that one makes the most sense to me. It's just like, no, it's a packaged Docker image that has the MCP server inside and you expose it on some ports and talk to it. I mean, I don't know if you have an opinion on which packaging version is best.
I do. We've solved this problem. It's containers, right? Dockerized MCP servers make complete sense. And you're right. Yeah. When Anthropic, introduced the protocol, they also rolled out SDKs in Python, in JavaScript, for Go. I think there might even be a Rust SDK. So we've seen, all these MCP servers popping up using all these languages. So yeah, now you got to have Python and Node.js and Go all installed just to run all these things. And that's pretty annoying. So we definitely, I think containerization is the right way to go. Solve that runtime, solve the isolation. You can be very particular about what network access you give to a container or what file system areas you mount into a container, those sorts of things. So we think the container model really makes a lot of sense.
It sounds more like authentication would be the governing factor versus like what you expose to the Docker container. I think I'm coming at this from a different angle than you and Ned were just talking about it. But if I give it my credentials, which of course is the easiest thing to do, I want to log into the database, here's my credentials. My credentials probably have write access. So I can govern which tools I expose, which tools I, flip the little radio button to on in the MCP server. Is that a guarantee that that MCP server won't misuse my credentials? Is the tool not able to, like freewheel write access to something when I just say, go and read it?
I mean, ultimately, that'll come down to the implementation of the tool, right? And how it's wrapping the interactions with the backend system, whether it's an API or, some of these MCPs are just, wrapping like the database library for whatever database system you're using. And so, as long as the tools are well scoped and well written, then no. And again, you're in the loop as the human authorizing these tool interactions and what is going to be executed. So, again, look at those prompts when they come to you and don't just accept when it comes to MCPs. But you mentioned, authentication. There's kind of two ends of authentication, right? Because there's running MCP servers locally, but enterprises, that doesn't really work, right? If you have 1,000 developers running 1,000 copies of the same MCP server on every developer's workstation, just doesn't scale. It doesn't work. And so
no.
One of the things we're starting to see is really enterprises are talking about centralizing MCP hosting within the organization. But that introduces a whole new world of challenges. Right now, you do need authentication to the MCP server, authorization to what tools an individual is allowed to use. And then on the back end, having a single, personal access token or database login doesn't work because now you've lost all auditability and traceability when you have multiple users hitting this thing. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. The MCP spec does now have an authorization framework in it for that kind of front end, authorizing to the MCP server. It's based on OAuth, really sparsely implemented so far. It has not really been picked up yet. I think we will start seeing that. On the back end, it's kind of up to every MCP server, right? Because the MCP protocol can't possibly account for every way that you might need to authenticate to a back-end service. Does the API support OAuth? Maybe. Does it support LDAP? Probably. Bearer tokens, usernames and passwords, right? So that's going to be up to like the MCP servers. In the meantime, we may see organizations like run a lot of really tightly scoped copies of the same MCP server for different like use cases. Or at least you can kind of bring that scope down. But yeah, this is all stuff that really still, there's a lot of room to solve it for enterprise use cases.
Yeah. I mean, I would almost want a way for the MCP server to customize which credentials it's using based off of who's accessing it. If we're moving this from off of my desktop, which you're right, like as an individual, just tinkering around with this stuff, it's fine for me to run it locally. But, not everybody's going to have Docker Desktop installed or Python. So it makes sense to move it off to a server that's actually serving these up. But now I want to customize the credentials that are being used. And I might not want to use the exact credentials that the person accessing is using. I might want to create more dynamic credentials for that MCP server on demand that are scoped in a way that's considered safe. I don't know what a framework looks like that supports that.
That sounds like OAuth to me. Like that sounds like machine identities with OAuth. I know that we're starting to build that, but I know you can issue tokens that are delegated from your user that have a subset of your permissions. I've been playing around with this, building a Teams Bedrock chatbot on the side as a side project. So is that the future? Is it machine identities, Dan, or what do you see coming?
Yeah, I mean, I think OAuth is the future of this. Like I said, in the MCP spec now, there is a second version of an OAuth framework. There was a version released in March that the community didn't really rally behind. It was basically expecting every MCP server to be both an authorization and resource server, which was not really the way the community was interested in going. There is a new draft of the authorization spec for MCP, which simplifies that, brings it down to just serving as the resource server, right, for an OAuth workflow. And so potentially, what could happen there is you have an MCP server that implements the authorization workflow for access to itself, basically from a client, and then could potentially, do impersonation or a key exchange, right, with that token to then access the backend service. Now, it does imply that the backend service also can handle those mechanisms and isn't just username and password. But I think that's a lot of what we'll start to see. And we've seen some SaaS vendors start remotely hosting their own MCP servers too, and either using an API key that you put in your client again and just implementing their own auth, or we actually just saw Atlassian release a hosted MCP server for their SaaS products, and they are using the OAuth flow. And so from the Claude web interface, you can now go through an OAuth flow to authorize the connection to their MCP server. So they have gone down that route, and I think we'll see more of that.
Okay. And I would assume, like, depending on what you log in as, it will scope your permissions on that MCP server appropriately.
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically.
that is the idea, yes.
That would have to have user threading. It would have to keep track of all the different people connecting and associate them with their tokens. And we could have some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities on this kind of like centralized infrastructure. That's still so scary. I mean, it definitely is maturing from what you said. That sounds very promising, but I'm still pretty scared to run it in an enterprise. Are we in a place where like I'm in charge of the platform team at, Enterprise FUBAR, and I want to put in a remote MCP server? Are we there yet, or should I wait?
I think we're early for that, at least in terms of hosting these kind of individual MCP servers versus, say, accessing one that's provided by your SaaS vendor, right? So, yeah, I think we are early on that. We are starting to see like MCP Gateway and orchestration services start to appear. The authentication and authorization framework is still very much a work in progress. Part of the issue there is the clients haven't implemented. So if your client can't do that OAuth workflow or provide a JWT token or whatever input flow, then it's kind of a non-starter to start with. But yeah, we are starting to see kind of the API gateway style solutions appear, but for MCP servers.
So if everyone could just stop doing MCP for like 6 months while we just formalize all this authentication, that would be really helpful. I do worry that like the cultural impact of this is if we don't support it as an enterprise formally, then absolutely every developer is going to have their own little seed of MCP and we're going to have 1,000 little problems instead of one big problem, I don't have a question there. I'm just doom scrolling here about my life.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And I think that we have seen that happening, right? That is what's happening. I was at a conference just last week and talking to a few folks from some pretty large orgs. And they said, yeah, they've been really struggling to roll out MCPs in the ways that are possible now, which is basically put it on every developer's desktop and looking for solutions for that. So it's happening now, but yeah, we need a better way.
Shadow MCP.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, when Kyler posed the question regarding security, you mentioned a tool called Toolhive. And I'd like to know a little more about that and how that applies to MCP in particular.
Yeah, so Toolhive is a tool that I work for a startup known as Stacklok, and we are working on tools to help developers use AI tools better and with more control. And so Toolhive is a project that we released a few weeks ago, and it is basically a really lightweight tool to help find and run MCP servers more easily and more securely. So we do that, again, back to the containerization topic, right? We do that by containerizing the MCP servers.
So if it's not containerized already, you can take something that uses TypeScript or Python and put it in a container as intended.
Yeah, that's a really cool feature that we added into Toolhive. So yeah, we have a small internal registry of curated MCP servers that are already containerized. You can just use Toolhive and run them with a single command. But then if you bring your own container, we can run that. If you just have an MCP server that isn't containerized, right? Whoever wrote it hasn't containerized it, but it uses UV or NPX or Go to build. Mm-hmm. We can, on the fly, build a container around that source package and then run it for you. We've got built-in secrets management too, so an encrypted secrets store where we're using either your OS keychain to encrypt the secret store, or we can read secrets out of 1Password now too.
Okay.
And also a permissions and authorization framework that we're starting to build out around these containers too.
Okay.
Is it OAuth based, or can you talk about the permission schema?
Yeah, the authorization framework that we've built into it is OAuth based. Again, right now, there aren't really clients that can support that. But basically, the idea is you can bring a JWT, Java Web Token, and do authorization, verify the authentication, and then do authorization using an OAuth flow and using actually Cedar policies. Cedar's a policy framework from Amazon. But you can use, write your own policies to authorize access to the tools based on the claims in your token. And that's really, right now, today, really useful in a Kubernetes workflow. So one of the other things we have with Toolhive, we have a command line, right, that just runs on your laptop, your desktop, if you want to run MCP servers locally, but we also have a Kubernetes operator. And so we can actually orchestrate MCP servers in Kubernetes, handle the ingress to the servers, handle, spinning up each MCP server in its own pod. But also, you can potentially use, if you have an OIDC provider wired into your Kubernetes cluster, you can potentially use pod identity to authorize agents running in other Kubernetes pods into the MCP servers. So that's like kind of one place where it can be applied today, even without client support. So more like custom agent workflows, custom AI application workflows that you might be building.
Okay. So there's really two modes for running Toolhive today. There's just running it from the command line locally or running it as an operator in Kubernetes. When you're running it locally, does it run as a persistent service in the background, or is it more you just kick off a command, let it do its thing, and then it kind of fades away?
Yeah, so Toolhive itself is a CLI utility, right? You run commands. It will spin up the Docker container for the MCP, keep it running. It will also spawn an HTTP proxy process in front of that container. And that's how the client then connects through into the MCP server in the container. One of the things we didn't really get into is like how the agents actually interact with these MCP servers. Like most of them, they're an executable and they're written to use standard input and output. right? They're expecting the agent just executes it and sends it input through standard IO and gets the output from the process. When you containerize it, that doesn't really work, but there is also an HTTP transport method. And that's how we connect the clients to the servers, basically through a reverse proxy that Toolhive spins up.
Gotcha. My main experience working with MCP servers has been through VS Code. So going into the settings and updating my user settings, there's a whole MCP server section now. And so you can add servers and it takes different arguments depending on, like what context it runs in. Is it a Docker? Is it running Python, etc.? And I don't know a lot more beyond that, except like copying and pasting the instructions from whatever MCP server I'm trying to experiment with. When you spin something up with Toolhive, does it also spit out what you need to put into your VS Code or whatever tool you're using?
I'll do you one better. For some clients, we will just go ahead and configure them for you.
Oh,
Insert the entry that you need. And it's nice because it's just a simple entry. It's a single URL, because anything else like configuration parameters, command line arguments, secrets, environment variables that the MCP server needs, we're handling that when you spin it up with Toolhive. So now your client configuration file is just a URL, localhost and the port that the proxy is listening on, and the name of the MCP. And yeah, so for VS Code, Cursor, Claude Code, and a few others, we can just go ahead and configure that for you. Or you can output kind of the standard config format. So you can configure other clients that maybe we don't support today directly.
Is there, so I'm just trying to take on a persona. I'm the platform owner for Enterprise Foobar. Is there like an enterprise management tool for it? Like there's probably tons of people with MCP servers running on their clients. I have to manage, 3,000 installs of MCP servers. Do any of the tools from this company help me do that scale? Because that's an impossible job without some really good tools.
Not today. That's certainly something we're thinking about. So Toolhive itself it's free. It's open source, right? You can download it, run it.
Okay.
We're not commercializing it in any way like that yet. But yeah, certainly centralized management, especially as you get into the Kubernetes hosting workflow, is definitely something we're thinking about, as we kind of continue building out Toolhive.
It is wild how quickly this entire AI and MCP train is moving.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, this launched back in November.
I thought it was years ago, by the way, when you were like, oh, it launched. And I was like, yeah, it launched 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. No, several months ago.
No, it just feels like it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, every month is about equivalent to a year in AI and MCP time. Another thing that I've heard a little bit about and have not had a chance to dig into is A2A, which is Google's agent-to-agent communication. Does Tool have any role to play in that, or is that just a totally separate technology? And Ned, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about.
It is a separate technology, so it's kind of operating at a different layer here, right? Where MCP is like an agent to tools, agent to systems. A2A, kind of as the name implies, is agent to agent. So but you can have these orchestrated systems of multiple agents that are coordinating tasks with each other, passing context back and forth, or handing off tasks from one specific agent to another for these kind of more complex multi-system tasks. That's what A2A is. So Toolhive doesn't play in that arena where, Toolhive is only operating in the MCP area. But yeah, A2A and these multi-agent workflows are definitely something, we've been doing a lot of research around at Stacklok too, and thinking a lot about, and how we can, bring some additional tools that might help with those kind of workflows.
A2A sounds like something between like an event queue, like SQS from AWS, and the Matrix and the cluster of robots that are just coming to eat everyone. What is the purpose of A2A? What is a valid business purpose for a fleet of bots talking to each other?
I think common use cases is going to be, we have these kind of specific agents that are, wired up to specific models or tools, and they have each, their own specific task within a workflow. So you might have one model that is, wired up for writing tests, another one that's wired up for executing tests, and you maybe want to have them separate, so that, there's not pollution, I guess, between them. But what A2A allows basically is each agent to advertise its capabilities to an orchestrator or a manager agent that is kind of over the whole fleet of agents. With A2A, an agent exposes a card, basically its agent card of, hey, here's what I can do. Here's what tools I have access to. Here's what I am and what kind of my purpose is. And then the orchestrator agent can basically use those to divvy up tasks between the individual agents.
Cool. That's a really novel way to beat the context window problem that started to arise with models where, they just have learned too many different things and they kind of go crazy or they start to sort of scatter a little bit.
Yeah, and that's a problem with MCP too, right? Because these MCPs are exposing all these tools, right? You might have a single MCP server that's exposing a few dozen tools. And so now you get a bunch of these things to interact with all your systems, and it can get really easy to overwhelm a single LLM with all this context about these tools. And yeah, there's been definitely some findings that they can get lost and get confused about which tool to actually run. And so controlling like which tools are available to which agents at what point in the workflow is really important.
Running in agent mode on VS Code, I've seen a process spin its wheels out trying to fix a script because it tries to fix it one way and then it says, oh, I think I found the problem. And then it'll do something else. Oh, I think I found the problem. And it just repeats that over and over until the context window ends. And then it goes, I've been working on this for a really long time. Would you like to continue? And the answer is probably no. You should just stop now.
Mm-hmm.
They can definitely get wound around themselves in the reasoning process. I enjoy the clients that have like the context window graphically represented. So you can actually see as each interaction happens, as it loops back, it just grows and grows and grows and grows until it finally hits the window. And some of them also visualize your costs too, which is another important thing.
It's funny, behind the scenes, like someone measured this bot can go to this amount where it's 100% and it stops. And that's what you see as a user. But the developer of that was like, when I let it go past there, it starts to go crazy. Like it starts to forget the beginning of the conversation. And it works very much like an attention span in my experience, except with more insanity, I think. Interesting.
All right. Dan, you've piqued my interest in Toolhive, so I'm definitely going to have to give that a try. If people are interested in finding out more about it, is it just a GitHub repository or is there like a whole website set up for it?
Yeah, just a GitHub repo for now. We're working on the website part, so you can find Toolhive on GitHub. It's under the Stacklok organization. That's Stacklok, because of course you have to drop a letter.
Okay.
And you can find it on GitHub. Yeah, you can find a link to it on stacklok.com. Also have toolhive.dev pointing there. But yeah, find it on GitHub. We've got a Discord set up for the community. And, we've been blogging on the Stacklok space on the Dev2 site too. So you can find a lot of our engineers writing about Toolhive over there.
Cool. And any last thoughts about MCP in general?
Yeah, I think just the main thing, we're talking about it, it's all the rage, but it is for a good reason. It really does close some gaps in the capabilities of agents and these AI systems, but it is still the new kid on the block. These security challenges are very much not solved. And so things are still going to be messy, especially for enterprises for a little while. So I think just, for now, I would say treat MCP servers like any other code you would run on your machine, right? Make sure it's coming from a trusted publisher. Take a few minutes to look at it and look at the tool descriptions. Make sure you're protecting yourself from some of these potential vulnerabilities. And if you're starting to look at running them remotely, secure transport is something that is not in the MCP protocol spec, so that's your job. And authentication, authorization, right now are kind of your job. So you got to really think about those things. And in the meantime, run MCP servers locally and use Toolhive.
Awesome. Well, Dan Barr, thank you so much for being a guest today on Day 2 DevOps.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Dan for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we would love to hear them. Hit either of us up on LinkedIn or send some feedback via packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can find me, Ned Bellavance, at nedinthecloud.com, and my amazing co-host, Kyler Middleton, blogging over on Let's Do DevOps. And we're both very active on LinkedIn. Stop by, say hello.
You should also check out a new entry to the Packet Pushers family, Technically Leadership, hosted by Laura Santamaria, to learn how to become an effective and confident leader. Until next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.